It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor John Crawford. When we're looking for a keynote speaker, an evening speaker for this forum, it was very apparent to the team that we wanted to really draw the parallels between healthy farming and healthy soils and growing good produce, and I guess the public health debate, which is costing our health system billions of dollars, no doubt, through obesity and various other problems. And it was highly recommended that I try is the word, approach Professor John Crawford, who is our next speaker. And I thought, well, this is fantastic. So I did pursue John with great haste. And very fortunately, he was very happy to accept our invitation. I'm not sure if John's been to Albury-Wodonga before, but it's very good to have you in town for this evening's presentation. John Crawford, as you'll guess from his accent, is a proud Scotsman, and we did draw a comment on that, how we thought Scotland should secede. That might happen too. We might get some more on that. But in the interim, John has holds the Judith and David Coffey Chair for Sustainable Agriculture at the University of Sydney, which I believe is a new chair that's just been done, and the Coffey family have been very supportive with the chair and their financial backing. He has a background in physics, and his interest is in the origins of organisation in cells and communities, and has led him to uncover properties in complex living systems that have sustained their function in the face of disruption. His current projects range from modelling of soil to working with a whole range of community and business representatives on projects that focus on social and cultural systems of food production, food distribution and food consumption. I'll leave it at that because it does go on, and I don't know how many pages I've got here that he sent through, but so with no further ado, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks very much, Lachlan. And I can't actually see you. First of all, I'd just like to thank you for turning up after dinner. I didn't quite know how this was going to work. I thought it might be during dinner or in between courses or something. It's after dinner, and we've all had a lot of lovely wine, and I'm still having some lovely wine. So I appreciate you coming, and I also appreciate being asked. I love coming out to talk to farmers. I live in the city, and I don't get out enough, and it's great, and I've greatly enjoyed talking to people during the day. So I was asked to do something a little bit big picture, and as Lachlan pointed out, I'm an astronomer who works in soil and has been recently moved to the Charles Perkins Centre, which is a biomedical research centre. And I think that's great because we tend to forget, and actually I'll just go to the next slide. There's a real danger I'm just going to, what we call haver in Scotland. So if I stick to the slides, there's a chance we'll get out of here before tomorrow morning. We forget, so I'm just going to go, in fact, I'm going to go straight to the first slide, Reconnecting Agriculture with Environment. This title, Reconnecting Agriculture with Environmental and Societal Health, we forget, or you don't forget, but people who live, 80% of the population that live in cities forget what food is actually for, and of people who trade commodities on the international market forget that food is not a commodity, it's actually the basis of human health. And agriculture, if it is to be sustainable, and if it's to be able to continue to provide us with food that will sustain our health, has to be environmentally regenerative or restorative. Yet there's nothing, and I'll come to this later, there's nothing in our food system that incentivizes people like you, and when I say incentivize, I mean provide you with the necessary financial means to restore the environment, and I really mean, well, I'm going to focus on soil here, but the other ecosystem services that continued food production depends on. There's nothing in our food system that financially incentivizes that, and there's nothing in the food system that financially incentivizes food that supports societal health. In fact, it's the opposite. So our food system promotes environmental degradation by focusing on production at all cost, and promotes an obesity epidemic, and also an insufficiency of certain important micronutrients that affect people even in developing countries, and certainly in developed countries, and certainly in developing countries as well. So I just want to make a couple of points about this whole story about reconnecting agriculture and with environmental and societal health, because it is reconnecting, getting our act together and recognizing that that's where agriculture needs to be, but it's very far from there now. Then I want to talk about the resilience of the soil habitat, and basically because, well, I'll explain why. Never mind, I'll talk too much otherwise. Soil function, what is soil? We've heard a lot today about what's organic matter and microbes and stuff. And I just want to revisit what I think soil is from my perspective of actually fairly recent profound ignorance. So what my conclusion is, what soil is. And then talk about the bigger issues about the link between soil, society, and the economy. Soil has for thousands and thousands of years supported some of the most sophisticated civilizations on the planet who have risen and fallen on the back of their soils, and rather the inability to look after their soils, not necessarily because they didn't know how to do it, but because for some reason they just didn't do it, right? And it was to do with the way that society valued food and where their priorities were, and a bit short-termism and a whole bunch of stuff, no doubt. And then finally, I just want to finish with a few things about where we might want to move food and agriculture and innovation in the future. So, part one, I'm going to try and do this in half an hour. The doors are locked, by the way, so we're together till this finishes. It almost beggars belief that we need to have a slide talking about agriculture supporting maintaining environmental services that it depends on and supporting societal health, but we do need to have it. Our food system, we all know, is degrading the environment. Everywhere where there's agriculture, soil is being degraded. Even the most conservative forms of agriculture still lose soil carbon and still lose soil at something like 10 times the rate that it's being regenerated by natural processes. Water withdrawals, in the next 20 years, half the world's population will have to live on 500,000 litres of water a year per person. Sounds like a lot, but actually that's regarded as being kind of sub-Saharan drought, horrible, not enough water to keep you healthy level, right? 50% of the population, because most of the water withdrawals are massively unsustainable. We have a growing, developing world that's changing its food consumption patterns in a way that's driving an obesity epidemic in the West, and the rate at which obesity is becoming a problem in developing countries is even more scary. And then, so we talk about the dilemma of population growth, but actually, at least in equal part, the problems that we face in terms of food security are also down to our choices of consumption. So we've got this consumption that's driving an obesity epidemic, but it's also placing unsustainable demands on our soil. So we'll have to produce, the soil is currently producing twice as much per unit area as it did when I was born. And it's going to have to produce twice as much again, or something like twice as much again, if nothing changes in the next 20 to 30 years, which is more than it's ever produced, ever, and I'll talk about that a couple of slides later on. No, I won't. I'll talk about it now. Because we're actually farming 40% of the surface of the planet. 40% of global primary productivity, that's this amount of plants that are growing on solar energy around the world. 40% of those are grown for consumption, directly or indirectly for consumption. The other 60%, most of that can never be for human consumption for various reasons of where it is and because we want to conserve a bit of the natural environment. So something like only 10% of available net primary productivity is probably available in principle to divert for human consumption. Yet somehow we have to double the amount of food that we're producing. The nice thing about these problems is that it's starting to reconnect us with our environment. We tended, at least when I was younger, environment was treated as something you dealt with if you had enough, it was a bit of a luxury. And if schools and education and stuff was it, the government had its budget roughly in balance, then it would worry about the environment. But food is a great connector. And there's going to be a reconnection, very significant reconnection. It's already happening between urban society and the environment via the food system. So we've got all these challenges, and these are massive, massive challenges. I would argue they're probably the most significant challenges that the human race has faced. And the solutions, we cannot treat these problems in isolation. The solutions must embrace environment, health, behavior, the choices that we all make. Somebody, I forget who it was, Michael Pollan, I think, said, we vote 3 times a day for the kind of countryside that we want when we eat. So behavior and behavior change on farm and in cities is a huge, huge factor here. And of course, there is some technology. The solution must embrace all of these dimensions. Now, here's an interesting, you don't need to read it. And I know it's a graph, and somebody told me about 3 minutes before I started talking that, I hope you're not going to show any graphs. So this is a picture. This is a picture, it's not a graph. And it's the World Economic Forum. You probably heard of Davos. These guys meet once a year, and they kind of compare the quality of the champagne on their business class flights as they go out. So these are 500 to 600 of the world's top thinkers in economics and business, and not at all your sort of left-wing liberal type kind of hippie people who worry about the environment. These are hard-nosed business people, get together once a year, and they think about what the risks that face the global economy in the next 10 years. And they publish a really, really good report. If you've never read them, you can download them from the web for nothing. The risk reports, 10-year forward look, what does the risk landscape look like? And they make one of the nice diagrams they produce is this plot of risk for that's unlikely, and this is very likely, and this is impact going from, because it's the World Economic Forum, they measure impact in dollars, and it goes from 50 billion to $1 trillion in terms of impact, and everything is clustered up here. All these points represent different risks, and they're all clustered up here, very likely and high impact. Now, diagram number 2, which is a picture, not a graph, is, and this is actually a picture, it's the same risks, but included is the linkages between them. So these risks are not only incredibly likely and incredibly high impact, but they all interfere with each other. And the consequences of that is that if one of those risks were to eventuate, it changes the whole risk landscape because it propagates through these links to all the other risks. So no matter what anybody will try to convince you about what the future holds a great deal of uncertainty. And the level of interconnectivity and the pace of change that the world is, that kind of characterizes the state of the world now is unprecedented. And so I think the level of uncertainty, there are a bunch of potential really quite serious risks. How things will actually turn out is anybody's guess. Faced with that kind of a future, the logical focus is to try and be as resilient as possible so that we can, whether you're running a farm or a business or a family or whatever, focus on resilience so that no matter what the next 10 years unleashes, you can at least try and absorb some of the impact. Now, you can take this diagram and you can identify certain key clusters of risk. Some risks are more tightly connected than others. And the World Economic Forum recognizes 3 major risk nexus. The plural of nexus is nexus like sheep. And 2 of those are connected with the financial issues, which I'll come back to in a minute. But the third one is what I call the sustainable food nexus. And I see this as Australia's great opportunity, and Michael Jeffrey talked about that this morning. This is the risk that connects food security to energy price volatility, to water security, to climate change, to health, infectious and chronic disease. These are a bunch of risk factors that are, every year on year in these reports, are the highest in terms of likelihood and impact. Now, economists will tell you that whenever humanity is faced with some kind of crisis, the economy just sorts it out, right? So we're very clever and we innovate our way out of trouble. If you look back in history into how we innovated our way out of trouble, we innovated our way out of trouble by borrowing from the future. We borrowed, first of all, in the organic economy, it was the availability of it was water basically ran the organic economy. We're running out of water. Next, the Industrial Revolution was fueled by the availability of cheap energy, principally fossil fuel. We're now contaminating the environment to such an extent that it may be changing the whole dynamics of the Earth system. And in the last 40 years, innovation has been driven by the availability of cheap credit. And we all know what happened when we realized that we were borrowing unsustainably. Question is, what have we got left to borrow? We have not got anything left to borrow. We're faced very much with a kind of a wall of natural resource limitations that somehow we have to find a way around that isn't going to follow the same kind of pattern as previously. Now, I just want to make a quick point about interesting things about connections between networks and resilience. So remember the picture, which wasn't a graph, of the network of risks. There's very interesting properties of networks that relate to resilience and the capacity to absorb shocks. This is a picture of a random network where each node in the network is connected by roughly the same number of links to other nodes in the network. It's called a random network, and in the event that nodes fail or some risk eventuates, the network collapses catastrophically. This is not a random network. It's called a scale-free network, but it doesn't matter what it's called. The point is that some of the nodes are much more highly connected. So this one's got lots and lots of neighbors. This one's only connected to 2 other neighbors. These kinds of networks are much more resilient. So here, if you randomly fail the same number of nodes as we did here, the network still remains pretty coherent and connected. Because actually most things connect through these highly connected points, which are called hubs. Now, whilst these types of networks are very resilient to random failure, they're not resilient to deliberate failure. So if you knock out one of the hubs, then the network will become fragmented and highly disconnected and highly disrupted. And I want to argue that soil is a bit like one of those hubs. And why that's important is if you're going to protect or invest effort to maintain resilience in the future, you invest your effort on the hubs. Because if you maintain these hubs, you maintain resilience in the system. So soil as a hub, this is why I think soil is so important. And most of you who work with soil knew this anyway. So here are the bunch of risks: water, food, energy, health, and climate. Well, soil is currently, 40% of the world's agricultural soils are severely degraded. Degraded or severely degraded, where severely degraded means up to 70% of the topsoil is gone. Where studies have been done carefully, like in Europe, it turns out that the rate at which soil has been physically lost means that within 100 years there won't be much topsoil except on the flats. In Europe, now in other parts of the world where less sustainable soil practices are being used, that figure is far shorter, and a very, very rough calculation for a global average is about 50 years before we have really quite serious loss of topsoil. Water. 70% of the use of fresh water by humans is in agriculture for irrigation. Even moderately degraded soil holds 50% less water. And staggeringly, since 1960, 30% of the sea level rise has occurred from irrigation water. So that's ancient aquifer water being applied to soil. The soil can't hold the water in the root zone, so it just passes by the plant out to sea. 30% of sea level rise. We're filling up the ocean with fresh aquifer, ancient aquifer water, because in a large part due to soil degradation. 99.7% of our food comes from soil. If we do nothing about soil degradation, one estimate puts the impact on food production at a 30% reduction in the next 20 to 50 years. That's in face of demands requiring something like a 50% increase. And don't forget, we're already using 40% of the available net primary productivity diverted into agriculture. There's not a lot spare. In China, the Chinese Ministry of Water acknowledges there will be a 40% reduction in the entire Chinese wheat crop just due to soil degradation by 2030. Where are they going to get the wheat from? Energy. Soil is using nutrients faster than it can be sustainably replaced. We've had plenty of talks on that general topic today. Just almost 2% of the global energy budget goes on fertilizer production. I don't need to tell the farmers in the audience that the cost of fossil fuel is impacting on fertilizer costs phenomenally. And of course, irrigation is also irrigation and fertilizer input can be significantly more than 50% of the total input costs in farms. And then there's the competition for energy as other forms of energy become more and more difficult to access in the environment. We're finding competition. Our same piece of soil is having to produce biofuel. There's competition for coal seam gas extraction and other threats for agricultural land. Health. 60% of the world's population suffers micronutrient deficiency. 1 in 3 children will have stunted cognitive and physical development due to malnutrition. 1 in 3 children globally. It's incredible. And then, of course, a Western-style diet, which is a very high level of grain-fed beef in the diet, also can lead to increasing the pressure on soil. Then finally, as we heard from a number of talks today, including Dan Murphy's talk, soil is a very important sink of carbon. There's more carbon in the soil than there is in the whole atmosphere, plus the whole plant life on Earth. But where there is agriculture, even the most conservation-type styles of agriculture, the soils will have something between 25 and 75% less carbon than adjacent soil that hasn't been involved in agriculture. And estimates are that Australian soils have lost around about 70% of their soil carbon due to unsustainable historical practices. So, soil is a key, is linked to a number of key risks in the future, and the fact that our soil is not being cared for in the way that it might be cared for has the potential to exacerbate all of these risks. But the advantage is that if we can fix the soil, then we can contribute significantly to a large number of problems. So let's talk about resilience of soil. We don't know what the future holds, so let's make our soil as resilient as possible. This, if it works, is a movie. Now, somebody said movies are good. They're not good if they don't work. Now, I'm going to go into my files and show this. Yeah, there we go. Because you've never seen this before. This is a 1 millimeter piece of soil. It's been scanned using high-resolution X-ray microtomography. So when you're sick and you go to hospital, you get a CT image. This is a CT image of sick soil. Only this soil's not so sick. What do you notice about this piece of soil? Speak up. There's what? Cavities, pores. And what about the pores? You can fly through it. Now, the porosity of this soil is about 15% at these scales. These pores are the pores, they're about somewhere between 50 and 100 microns across, depending on which one you're looking at. These are the pores that are the habitat for the microorganisms in soil. These are the pores that hold water against gravity. They're also the pores that allow water to move from the soil into plants. They're also the pores that allow oxygen to penetrate into the soil so that microbes can respire and do the things that microbes need to do in soil. If you try to imagine what soil looks like at these scales, you've got incredibly complex thin films of water. So the water that's held in soil against gravity forms these amazingly intricate water films covering these surfaces, but doing so in such a way that the water film remains connected, because if it doesn't remain connected, then when the plant takes some water, it can only access a relatively small fraction of the volume of water. So good soil has connected water films over a very broad range of moisture contents. The other good thing that good soil will have is, whilst it maintains the connectivity of those water films, oxygen is still able to move through the pores and access almost every part of the volume of soil, because microbes need microbes need oxygen to be active, to a crude approximation, and if they don't have oxygen, they are very much less active. So microbes like to have the right mixture of air and water to survive, and plants need water and they need microbes, and plants supply carbon to the microbes, so that the whole system works because of the geometry of this pore space, which is incredibly organized. It's not random. It's highly organized in order to allow all these different things to happen. So how does it become organized? Because at the end of the day, you as farmers are trying to make that habitat as convivial to microbes in soil as possible, so that they can do the business that you depend on to produce food. And this is a simulation of a similar piece size of soil where we've simulated the distribution of oxygen. We use mathematical models to predict what the microenvironments of soil look like. And you can see that they are incredibly diverse. So the colors here represent oxygen concentration, and within a few hundred microns of one another, you can have very low oxygen concentrations adjacent to very high oxygen concentrations, and that matters a lot if you're a microorganism. And somehow we have to understand how the physical organization of the space and its consequences for resource flows into the habitat of soil affect its functioning and, more importantly, its resilience. Now, a long time ago, a couple of Australians, Malcolm Ord and Judy Tisdale at Adelaide, came up with a conceptual model for how that physical architecture comes about. And it's the byproducts of microbial activity. In this case, we've got some bacteria here and we've got some fungi. They release agents into the soil that bind soil particles together. So the more biomass you've got, the more binding of soil particles you've got. So you've got this idea of a simple, well, conventional wisdom is that microorganisms cause soil structure. There's no sense of why that soil structure may become organized other than it's stuck together by microbes. But nevertheless, it does implicate this interaction between physical and biological processes in creating the habitat that microbes exist in. Now, I've been studying this for far too long, just interested in where the organization in soil comes from. And again, using high-resolution X-ray tomography plus computational fluid dynamics, we can look at the effect that microorganisms have on the physical architecture of soil. So this red box here has two different soil samples in it, both of which are soil that has no microbes in it. We killed all the microbes by spraying it with gamma rays twice. On the right-hand box, we've got soil which has had microorganisms in it. And the numbers here represent the computer-simulated calculation of the hydraulic conductivity, how easy it is for things to move through that matrix. And you can see that the microorganisms have an impact on structure that is very significant. Down here, you're talking 4 or 5 orders of magnitude difference in the rate at which things can move in soil, like nutrients or oxygen. Hugely significant. In other words, microbes affect their environment, but they affect their environment in a way that has a very strong influence on the rate at which resources can flow to microbes. So instead of the conventional wisdom, microbes affect structure, we've got this additional loop that the structural changes that microbes induce actually feed back onto the activity of the microbes themselves. Now, as a physicist, whenever you get feedback loops, you think, great, because that then has a potential to drive some kind of dynamics in the system. So this could be something to do with how the system changes over time. We no longer can think of the soil microbe, soil and microbes individually. We have to start thinking of them as a system. And then again, doing some computer modeling, we can look at the consequences of the feedback between particle aggregation and the creation of microhabitats, the effect on the activity of the microbes, and then the consequences again for structure. We have a feedback loop where structure affects the microbial habitat in a way that affects the rate at which microbes can be active, which feeds back on structure through this gluing stuff. And that cycle maintains a dynamic. And the simulation here is time, and this is the connected porosity of the structure for different porosities. And you can see that the interaction between microbial gluing and the physical architecture of soil is such that you can go from a soil which has no connected porosity to something where the porosity increases for a period of time and then settles into some kind of equilibrium, but dynamical equilibrium state. This is a simulated compaction event, so there's no connected porosity, and the system will recover. In other words, there's a resilience in the system. It can recover porosity through this interaction between microbes and structure. Now, so we did some experiments. And to cut a long story short, I won't go into the details of how we did the experiments, but if anyone's interested, I can tell them later. But we managed accidentally to manipulate the ratio of fungi to bacteria in the system. You got it working. Did I do something wrong? There we are. So here we've got a treatment which was actually a dilution of field soil with sterile soil that gave rise to, never mind, gave rise to a range of ratios of the biomass which was fungal to the biomass which was bacterial, which reflected in the capacity of the soil to absorb shock and to be resilient, if you like. This is the recovered porosity after a compaction event, and where the fungal to bacterial ratio was lower, the capacity of the soil to recover connected porosity was compromised compared with the case where the fungal bacterial ratio was higher. A couple of important points. We didn't see any differences when we scanned the soil at resolutions of 53 microns and below. Only when we scanned at higher resolution did we see differences. In other words, the microbes are affecting structure, but at very fine scales. But these are the scales that do all the work in soil. These are the scales that hold water, that fix this air-water mixture and organize the connectivity of oxygen pathways and nutrient pathways and water pathways to plant roots. Now, it shouldn't really surprise us that microbes have this capacity to organize their habitat to their own advantage, because microbes have been around on the planet for about 85% of the time of the Earth's life. We've been around for a tiny, tiny amount. Microbes have basically always been here. And 3.5 billion years ago, the oldest fossil evidence we have of life are these things which, interestingly, in Australia still survive on the west coast, are called stromatolites. And they show up in the fossil record as organized patterns. So it's the organization again, organized patterns in rock fossils. And when you look at the real things, these are what they look like. They're pillars of sediment embedded with photosynthetic algae, blue-green algae. And there's this interesting interaction that where the algae are most active, they release glue, which binds sedimenting particles and allows the photosynthetic algae to rise above the sedimenting particles so that it doesn't get buried. Because the last thing you want to be, if you're a photosynthetic thing, is be buried and shaded from the sun. So they devised this clever feedback that created this organization in sedimentation and allowed pillars to rise up so that they could continue to survive. So in this picture of soil, you can almost think, the best analogy I can think of is a termite mound, where it doesn't make sense to think of the termite mound without thinking about termites, and you can't think about termites without thinking about the termite mound. The two things are inextricably linked, and scientifically Darwin called this the extended phenotype. So the phenotype is just the behavior of a living thing, but in this case the phenotype extends into the physical environment, where the termite colony is really the sum of the termite mound and the termites. And the termites go to enormous lengths to organize the architecture, the internal architecture of the termite mound in order to maintain humidity and temperature levels which are conducive to growth of the fungi that they feed on. And they're little farmers, but they organize the soil, the termite mound to optimize their environment. Microbes do the same. They create soil that is fertile, that allows plants to grow, because if it wasn't for plants, you couldn't have soil microbes. So there's this coevolution thing that's happened over billions of years. Now we can start to play around. This is mostly to try and impress my kids, because it looks like a computer game. But it's actually a simulated, we're trying to understand how the quality of the nutrition in the soil affects the distribution of fungal biomass, and therefore affects the local physical binding of particles in soil, to get a better handle on how this organization in soil persists and how it might be manipulated in degraded soil to help accelerate the rate at which soil can restore. So in this case, the green blobs are a nitrogen source, the grey stuff was carbon, and you can see that the fungi biomass is concentrating around the sources of optimal nutrition and creating an enmeshment of the particles which reinforce the favorable microbial sites in the soil. Now, so what can you do if you're a farmer that might, at the end of the day, remember that good farmers are trying to manage their soil in a way that improves the habitat for the microbes in the way I described. These connected films, connected pathways for oxygen, lots of surface area for microbes. How do you, as a farmer, with being huge and big and microbes being so small, affect these small scales? Well, it turns out, so here's an experiment. So some friends in France have got this long-term comparison between conventional organic and zero-till cropping systems. More than 30 years old is the trial. The same thing, just done again and again. And when you look at these, when you probe the physical architecture of soil, you see no great difference between conventional and organic. The biggest difference being in the tillage. So moving to a less disturbing form of agriculture, presumably an agriculture that's more conducive to fungal growth, leads to a much greater enhancement of the architecture at scales that matter. Now, organic agriculture, people will pick up soil and say, oh, look, it's really nice, you can get these nice aggregates. Microbes have no idea aggregates exist. The scales that matter for microbes are down at 50 microns and less. These are the scales we're looking at here. That's what matters functionally for soil, and actually, there's no difference between a conventional and organic at the habitat scale. If you want to restore the habitat in soil, be nice to it, just leave it alone. And here's some other things: porosity, the connected porosity. The red line here represents the zero-till, and you can see in all cases the porosity is higher. Not only is there more porosity, but it's more connected, and the carbon content is higher. Another example is pasture management using lucerne, or some other, in this case it's lucerne. Getting more carbon into the system. On the left-hand side, we've got a CT image of soil, 80 tons per hectare carbon. The lower, 50 tons per hectare carbon on the right-hand side. You can strip away the solid stuff and look at the pore space. You can immediately see that the high carbon soil has a very different kind of pore architecture. Again, these are the very small scales that matter functionally. And if you then simulate the distribution of water in both of those systems, you can see on the left-hand side, the higher carbon case, you've got water that's more homogeneously distributed through the volume. So more of the soil volume is holding water compared with the right-hand side, where the channels are large and the water just kind of passes straight through. So nearly there. This is the chemical formula for water. For every oxygen atom, there is 2 hydrogen atoms. This is the chemical formula for a human being, which is 375 million hydrogen atoms to 132 million oxygen atoms, blah, 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 blah. And all this stuff down here, which, copper and iodine and selenium. Selenium is an incredibly important mineral for health, and it's in tiny amounts. Now, all of this stuff up here is in the air, and all of this stuff down here is either in the soil or it's not in the soil. This is the periodic table. The colors here represent major nutrients, trace nutrients, and then the purple stuff, trace nutrients that matter for people. So the point I want to get across here is that just because soil grows healthy plants doesn't mean those plants will necessarily grow healthy humans or animals. And any farmer who grazes cattle knows that. You can have good-looking grass, but the cows can still have an insufficiency of selenium, for example, which can have profound effects for their immune system and their fertility. So if micronutrients are not in soil, they're not in you. Now, that's probably not surprising to a lot of you in here, but it's amazingly surprising to a number of people I've talked to in government. I've talked to a cross-parliamentary committee on agriculture who were interested in developing strategy for how we move forward with agriculture policy. It was a bit of a surprise to them, and they said, oh, I should be talking to the health department. And I was going, well, actually, maybe you should be talking to the health department if you don't get that food is actually implicated in health. There's a serious gap in strategy, and Michael, I'm sure you've come across similar levels of amazing ignorance in government. But your average person on the street in Sydney has no idea. They have no idea, right? Now, we all know, or you guys know, that not all soils are created equal. And Australia's soil is particularly depleted in certain types, depending on where you are, in certain types of micronutrients. But more significantly, we exacerbate those problems through modern breeding practices, which are focused on this goal of just producing more and more without necessarily having an eye on the quality of what's being produced. So modern wheat varieties contain about a third less selenium, zinc, and iron than varieties that were used 50 years ago, because there's been no incentive in breeding programs to maintain those micronutrient levels. Now, some countries, like in South America, Brazil, have breeding programs to make sure that their wheat varieties are rich in these micronutrients, but we care less in other parts of the world. Fruit and veg are the same, and partly because of this and partly because of the lack of availability of food in some cases, around about 60% of the world's population suffers from some kind of micronutrient deficiency. And on top of that are modern wheat varieties which are grown to produce bread, to produce wheat that can make bread really quickly in an industrial process that doesn't muck up machines, has gluten, forms of gluten in it that make 1 in 8 of us sick. And inflammatory bowel disease, which is a symptom of gluten intolerance, has very profound effects for a whole bunch of other things. The gut is the barrier between the outside world and the inside body, and is a major component of the immune system. And when the gut loses its integrity, all sorts of pathogens and allergens can enter the bloodstream and cause terrible problems. Gut health is an amazingly important thing. Yet we know very little. By comparison with our knowledge of illnesses for which we seek drugs, the amount of research that there's been on this healthy state and how to maintain the healthy state is negligible. Now, this is a really interesting graph. It's a graph, but it's a very simple graph, and it's a very interesting one, and you have to pay attention because it's really important. This is a graph of debt to GDP ratio for the G20 advanced economies predicted by the International Monetary Fund between 2000 and 2050. So here we are, round about 100%, which is already unsustainable. Now, if we maintain the social contract as it is, which means if we are willing to fund a social health care system, and of course, all of us We all know that we're getting old and there's not enough young people to pay our pensions and our welfare and all this stuff. That by 2050, the debt to GDP ratio will be 300%. That will never, ever, ever, ever happen, right? The point of this graph is to show the level at which the future is unaffordable. Healthcare based on sickness and people in hospital and drugs and cognitive decline and all that implicates is not affordable. There is no way around it. It's not affordable. Governments are beginning to face up to the pension issue. They're not facing up to the health issue because it's political dynamite. But rest assured, our children will not have a social health care system based on sickness. So we need to stop getting sick. Now, 40% of cancers are diet-related. Obesity, the link between obesity and other types of disease is very, very well established. Nobody needs to have a stroke anymore. Nobody needs to have cognitive decline to the same extent that we're seeing in the current population. All of these things are avoidable because we know basically they are issues to do with diet and lifestyle. They're choices. But it puts food back in where it should always be, a central role in maintaining health and avoiding sickness. So much of sickness is avoidable. The UK Foresight Obesity Report, published in 2007, 4 years and hundreds of people invested huge effort into trying to understand all the factors that affect the flow of nutrition from the environment through society and its impact on health. And they came up with a whole bunch of different things: social psychology, food production, this is us here, food consumption, physiology, individual psychology, individual physical activity, and the physical activity environment. All of these dimensions play a role in making it easier to be overweight than it is to be of a healthy weight. In here we've got the basal metabolism, metabolic pathways and things. Now, when you fill in those bubbles with all the factors, you end up with an incredibly complex network of factors that mitigate against us staying healthy. And somehow we have to find ways of making that system, moving that system from where it is now to a state where it's actually much easier to eat healthily than it is to eat unhealthily. And by the way, the really good part of that is that it takes pressure off the soil. We may eat less. That doesn't mean that farmers get paid less. It means they get paid the same to grow less but better. And hopefully we can channel some of the savings that we make by people not getting sick back into agriculture to maintain the health of the environment. So we can provide income streams for farmers that currently don't exist if we can find a way of changing this system to be much more sustainable. And don't forget, we have no choice. It will be like that. How we do it is another question. And this is a little bit, just a couple of slides on my views on how we might do things a little differently. Just to summarize, we're asking more from our soil than nature has ever asked from it ever, by a factor of probably 400%. Wherever there's agriculture, soil is in decline, and soil connects to so many things that all these risks that we face in the future and converging roughly in the next 10 to 20 years as being really probably the most significant challenges we've ever faced. Soil's right in there as being part of the solution. We've said already, we're going to demand 50% more from our soil, but can expect 30% less, so we need to get more from less, which is what this whole meeting's about. We need to get 50% more from 30% less. There you are. And in order to make progress, we have to embrace this complexity, the fact that physics and biology and chemistry and social science and economics are all part of the solution, and they all interplay and interlink. And actually, if you embrace the complexity, the solutions are easier because you've got more things to fiddle around with. And you can solve more problems. So, for example, there's an example of thinking carefully about how soil links to all these other things. If we fix soil, we fix a whole bunch of other things as well because we focus on the hub. I think the technological challenges pale into insignificance by comparison with the challenges to do with changing behavior. And I don't just mean changing individual behavior, but the way that governments behave globally. We require a level of international cooperation that is unprecedented outside wartime, and the chances of that happening are slim, I think. So we need, I believe, not to think about soil or microbes or chemistry or physics in isolation. We need to think about how those factors of the environment interact with food and health altogether, because it not only makes it easier to find solutions and win-wins and potential new income streams to farmers that may help solve other problems, but it may be the only way, because if we try to fiddle around as we've always done in part of the problem, we just create new problems somewhere else, unintended consequences. So this is an example. Healthier diets put less pressure on soil, and reduction in food waste could solve a lot of the pressure that the problems associated with pressure that we put on the land. We waste half the food that we buy. Just amazing. The business of agriculture, which is different from food, but related, has to reconnect with societal and environmental health. Full stop. And we need incentives built into the food system that target outcomes. I'm not talking about like organic procedures that tell you how you have to behave. I'm not interested in how we behave. I'm interested in what the outcome is. Is the outcome what we're really trying to achieve? And it has to be done in time. We don't have endless time. We have a relatively short time to find these solutions. So we need some kind of outcomes-based certification that people can trust and rely on, and is always based on the best available knowledge that we have, albeit that knowledge will continue to evolve. We have to return financial means to farmers to regenerate the environment. And why aren't we breeding crops that are healthier to eat and actually give more back to the environment? A lot of the breeding that's been done has been done in a way that makes less available to return to the soil. And we've only really been breeding for the top 5 centimeters of the plant. And we need some kind of new innovation model for agriculture R&D. There's this huge void in the middle of, so there's universities doing their own thing, and there's farmers doing stuff. And I was asking, every time I go anywhere, I ask farmers, how do you find knowledge that you can trust? And everybody has a different answer. Nobody says, oh, I go to the university because they're very clever. It's not like that at all. There's a huge void in between. And, you know, there are some innovative stuff happening in the US where farmers and the science base actually collaborate in a very meaningful and tangible way. An innovation that's happening on land finds its way into universities where they have the resources to really tease out the intricacies and validate, and then provide reliable information that other farmers can use and trust. And it's not just academic and farmers, it's also business, food industry, supermarkets, banking, all of these people who are involved in agriculture. Why aren't we all working together like people did in the Manhattan Project? They had 5 years or less, 3 years, to go from basic knowledge of the theory of the atom to create a terrible bomb before the Nazis did in the Second World War. Everybody worked together, and they did it. And things didn't work out so well afterwards. But nevertheless, and the Apollo mission, is landing people on the moon in 10 years, another example. If you decide to do it, it can happen, and it can happen quickly. We need to speed up the innovation cycle. It's not good enough. We don't have time, actually. University research. If you're going to do research, let's fund it. At the moment, research in universities is cheap because we subsidize it with student fees. I don't think that's right for either the students or the quality of the science that's done. Let's fully fund the research. Soils for Life, we heard all about it this morning. I knew Michael would be in the audience, so I better put that in. But Soils for Life is a great example of trying to engage meaningfully with a network of innovative farmers and trying to develop a set of knowledge that can be trusted and perhaps replicated by other farmers. And Michael made this point as well, there needs to be clear ownership. Nobody in government owns this nexus of environment, health, and food. In fact, 3 different departments. It makes no sense. How can it possibly be joined up? Somebody needs to own that agenda, and it needs to be owned at a high level. And so, the last point I want to make, if you want to make change in rural Australia, it's going to start in urban Australia by consumer behaviour and changes in consumer behaviour. At the end of the day, if consumers demand that farmers are resourced to restore the environment and restore their soils and produce food that's actually good for us, supermarkets will supply it. The problem is, at the moment, most people in cities have not a clue where food even comes from. So what about the role of urban farming? When I first came to the faculty, and I was talking to some people, and they wanted me to help them set up urban farms, and I thought, this is kind of a middle-class thing, right? It's people who want to pretend to be farmers in the cities, and I was more interested in people out Western Sydney who had low incomes and really no idea about what food actually meant. Now I've changed my mind. I've decided I was completely wrong in that. I think urban farming is potentially a really great way of connecting people to, not in the sense that you get real farms in urban situations, but you start to get people to appreciate and make little steps towards understanding that when a carrot or something's got a little kink in it or a wee bit of dirt on it, that actually that's probably a good thing. And that there is a difference in and the stuff that might go on their food, and they start to ask questions, like the Americans who've asked questions about the rice that's being imported, that they've now measured and found it contains 120 times the safety levels of lead. They didn't know they just thought rice is rice, but it matters where it's produced. People need to reconnect with that. So I think urban farming is an interesting thing. Now, I've been approached by a major international property development group that are building a whole bunch of houses in the estates in Sydney. They want to work with us to build a farm next to the schools that they're going to build, because they've done their market research. And if it's not the top, it's the second top factor that affects the desirability of location is availability of fresh food and a farmer's market. So it's good business for them. I think it's a great opportunity, especially positioning it next to schools, of helping educate urban people about what's going on in rural Australia and hopefully getting some of these resources flowing back into the country again. I better stop. Thanks very much.
One question I'd just like to ask you, with the soil in all the universities and at different places, I find most of the time...
Be honest.
Well, what I'm really trying to say is most of the time soil is usually not, for the growing purposes, not really looked at properly in the form like you've discussed with us tonight. Yours was very, very informing tonight. When I go ever anywhere and I find that there are agronomists or there are different organisations, when we're growing something, they're more concerned about what's above the soil than below the soil. And you never find, and at different times when I've been to the GRDC meetings and different times they're talking about different weeds, different things, the first thing I always ask usually is, what about the soil? I'm just so glad that tonight you have actually talked about the soil, because
Yeah.
no one else ever seems to bring that in.
And Dan talked about it as an ecosystem as well. I think that there are relatively few people. Soil, like every area of science, has suffered from silo effect, right? And so people who study the biology, they find clever ways of getting the biology out of soil and then studying it. And largely that's because it's very hard, right? It's complicated. I've worked in some very different types of areas in science, and I think soil is by far the most challenging thing I've ever done, and one of the reasons why I've stuck with it for so long. It's so interesting, but it's hard. It's really hard. Now we have some tools available to us now that are starting to open up what has been a black box till now. Why breeding companies haven't looked, or research into plant breeding hasn't looked below the ground, I just don't understand, because it's always been clear that, well, except that, of course, if you just treat soil as being a medium in which a plant stays upright and you can just load on all the nutrients and stuff that you need to make the plant look nice, then it's logical that you don't worry about the soil. But as we're moving more towards our understanding that that's not sustainable for all sorts of reasons, and we have to understand the basis of natural fertility of a system, then you have to start treating it like an ecosystem. And it's not like walking into forests and studying chimpanzees jumping from trees, which is relatively easy with a pair of binoculars. Looking at soil, you're looking at very small scales, and you somehow have to connect those small scales to the paddock and landscape even. It's really, really hard. So I think we're just wakening up. Partly wakening up and partly having the tools available to study the biology in context in the habitat.
John, just a quick question. I'm really interested in your new innovation model for agricultural R&D. If it was to come from your heart, where would you push that innovation towards, I guess?
How would if I was king of...
Yeah, if you were king of
Australia.
Scotland or Australia or wherever, how would you push that innovation model forward?
How would I push it forward? So that's a very good question. And there are some examples like the Kellogg Center in the US that is kind of a playground for academics and farmers and other people to work together. I would create a research center that was practitioner-led, and by that I mean the challenges come from the people who are facing them, the farmers, right? And so there'd be a process by which a consensus is reached amongst practitioners of what the significant challenges are. There'd be an exchange, of course, but it would be practitioner-led. It would be funded independently of anybody who might have a vested interest. Well, yeah, we'll try and find one of those, right? And it would be some kind of hybrid between rigor of now, I don't want to make. I know there's a bit of. I've come across almost an anti-science feeling, and sometimes when I go out to talk to farmers groups that science is conservative, it's too slow, it's disconnected from farming, and some of that's true. But on the other hand, as the great physicist Richard Feynman said, science is the best way we have of stopping us fooling ourselves, and we're the easiest people to fool. So I think we need that scientific rigor, but we need business pragmatism somehow married together, because I genuinely believe that we have a relatively short time to sort the problems out. Now, if Australia can get its act together, we can not only help our own farmers and benefit from the food security issues elsewhere in the world in terms of exports, but we will have a knowledge base which can be exported. And knowledge and food together are actually our biggest export, bigger than mining. So I would, that's what I would do.
John, assuming that we're all going to get sicker and sicker by eating food with no micronutrients, do you think perhaps you should switch to the Faculty of Medicine and start teaching doctors how to think? Because that could be there at the front line of keeping people healthy. But my doctor, he's a wonderful doctor, but he drinks a lot of coffee and eats junk food and things. So I think you should be in the Faculty of Medicine.
I used to chair. I'm in a medical research centre, right? I used to chair the main funding panel for agriculture, food and nutrition in the UK, and we had vets on that, and we had medics on that too. And even the medics admitted that if you've got something wrong with you that can't be fixed in one visit to the doctor, go and see a vet. Because vets are far more thoroughly trained in understanding link between nutrition and health than doctors are. And that's a failure of the system. It's not, you don't criticise doctors, they did their thing and they got what they could get in universities. And but at the end of the day, they're very much, it's a high throughput system. Get somebody in, give them, and people want a pill. They feel cheated if they say, "No, I'll go and eat some bananas." So go, what? Go to another doctor and get a pill. Thanks very much. So there's a bit of that as well. So there's a whole culture thing. But definitely, again, as I said, the future is about getting a better understanding of the link between nutrition and health, and that actually involves still quite a significant amount of research to cover up for all the years at which research funding has been towards managing sickness rather than maintaining health.
John, I congratulate you on your link with human health and food. I have also found 3 doctors, I believe, one in Corowa, one in Albury, and one in Perth, Western Australia, who are actually linking nutrition to human health.
You had to travel quite far.
The one in Perth is actually related to me, so I met him at a funeral and discussed the issue then.
You met him at a funeral, and that was a good advert, was it?
The funeral was actually his grandmother, my aunt, who only lived to 99 years, 11 months.
Okay.
So there's a bit of longevity there.
Well, I've been, you may have heard of Carol Hungerford. I referred to her in one of the slides. I nicked one of her slides. I asked her first. Carol Hungerford. She's written a nice book, Good Health in the 21st Century, and she's very knowledgeable at those kind of things.
John, you talked about benefits of nutrients for health, and I think there's an assumption that organic food might necessarily be automatically healthy and conventional food might automatically be unhealthy. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. It's interesting you talked about a premium for foods with micronutrients, because that's what we want. We want high quality food, no pesticides on it, full of packed micronutrients or the adequate nutrients. Is there any way you can test food and rate it so that it is, say, this carrot has all the micronutrients it needs? Doesn't matter where it came from, conventional or organic or wherever, and this carrot doesn't have all the right micronutrients.
I think
so buy that one, not that one.
It's a really good question, and I have talked to my colleagues who know about these things, the public health people. And there's a lot of debate about how to make it more difficult to eat unhealthy versus healthy, and therefore, so what the problem is, no individual component of the diet is neither healthy nor unhealthy. It's the combination of stuff, right? But to me, it doesn't seem unreasonable that there should be a limit to what you can call a carrot. and perhaps it's more about boundaries rather than a recipe. But I think there should be some kind of minimum standard.
John, you reflected on some, very, very interesting points. I've worked as a soil scientist over the last 30 years, helping people design ecosystems.
Oh yeah.
And the porosity and things like that. But it was lovely to hear you talk about selenium, because that's one of the micronutrients, if you like, that we've actually worked to try and build through the soil, plant, animal system. And we've been doing that for years and years, and I've got case studies that beautifully represent that. But in the last decade, what we've seen happen is the costs of those inputs that we're putting into foods, because we can't actually attract great premiums for them, the costs of putting those things in, like, do you know the price of,
Yeah.
of selenium now?
Yeah,
It's $10,000
Yeah.
a tonne.
yeah.
So we've had ecosystems in place to try and support food excellence,
Yep.
and it's become extremely difficult to sustain it.
Where's the person who's making compost out of food waste? Is he left? Anyway, closing the nutrient is bizarre, you know, as we become more and more urbanized. That's a great way of taking all the nutrition from the environment, focusing it into a small space and then flushing it out to sea or landfilling it, where the opportunity, and the World Health Organization has a whole bunch of standards for how you treat biosolids that maintain, that get around all the issues to do with the epidemiology of it all, that allow you to then put waste back on land again and close the nutrient cycle. There's a great opportunity for local industry to do that. I think the issue to do with distance is a problem. It becomes uneconomic currently, but the opportunity to locally recycle food waste and biosolids and put it back on the land to help refortify the soil is significant.
I guess I can ask a question.
Yes, you can.
Quite legitimately, I believe. I guess plant breeders yield is how we farm our current systems. More and more.
Yep.
We get paid.
It's the only thing farmers get paid for.
We only get paid on
Yep.
tons for whatever going out the front gate. My question to you is, do you think there's a public policy, not unlike a carbon tax, where there's a disincentive to reduce your use of fossil fuels? Is there some sort of public policy that could be used? Have you thought about this, that might be able to re-divert people or farmers into producing higher, micronutrient products, or get plant breeders to think about other things other than yield?
I can only think of. So, like I said, governments have no choice. They have to look at the food system, and of course, the real problem with the food system is the processing. I mean, it must break a farmer's heart that all the care they take over producing something, and then it ends up in a hamburger in McDonald's or something. And so the processing and the macronutrients, the protein to carbohydrate ratio is the big issue, right? Carbohydrates cheap, protein's expensive, so in order to maximize profit, food processors will pack as much carbohydrate into food as possible. That makes us all fat. That's the big issue. The micronutrient thing's a second order thing, but it's at least something that farmers have control over. So Denmark tried a fat tax. Didn't work, because people crossed borders to buy unhealthy food to avoid the fat tax. That is human nature, I'm afraid. So, I think of the way that we dealt with smoking, and it's not a good analogy, I'm told by my public health friends, but it's the best I've got, that smoking campaign worked because it made it incredibly difficult to smoke compared to not smoke. It was expensive, it was socially unacceptable because you killed your friends. You had to smoke outside. You can't stay with your friends around the table. You have to go outside and smoke like an embarrassing person. Although the conversations that go on outside pubs look a lot more interesting than the conversations that go on inside pubs, I must say. So it just became much more difficult and socially unacceptable. And drink driving is a bit like that as well. So in other words, it wasn't a single factor. Price was part of it. So a tax, if you like, on cigarettes was part of it, but there was a whole bunch of other things as well. Even putting a picture of the most grotesque images on cigarette packages, people will still smoke. So you need to do a whole bunch of different things to make it more difficult. So it needs to be more difficult to eat food that is bad for you and that degrades the environment, and easy to access and eat food that's better for you and regenerates the environment. How that is done requires cleverer people than me.